Welcome to Crimson Historians, the place where forgotten battles and forbidden histories come alive. The desert burns, heat shimmers off endless dunes like molten glass, the dust of tens of thousands rising in a choking haze that blots out the horizon. And in the middle of this storm of men and steel stand only 800 Norsemen, scarred wanderers from the frozen north, strangers in a land that feels as though even the earth itself resists their presence. 40,000 sworn to erase them, 800 sworn to die first. You hear it before you see it, the ground trembling beneath your boots, the air thick with the bitter tang of sand and sweat. Then the horizon moves, a living wall of death. Tens of thousands march forward, their banners black against the sun, pressing with one single purpose, to bury you, to erase your name forever beneath the sand. You stand there, 1 against 50. The shield in your hand feels heavier than iron. The air burns in your lungs. Every instinct screams to run. But there is nowhere to run. Around you, 800 warriors brace themselves, not for survival, but for eternity. The first war horn blasts, a sound so deep it rattles your chest. The desert shakes as the cavalry begins its thunderous charge. This is not a battle. This is a sentence. Even the land itself seems to mourn, as though it knows it will drink more blood than water today. And yet, against reason, against numbers, against the very breath of death itself, the 800 did not fall. This channel is growing into a community of people who refuse to let history's darkest stories fade. If you want to be part of that community, subscribe now. Don't just watch, become one of us. The year is the 1060s, and the world itself feels unsteady, as though it is shifting beneath men's feet. Pilgrims move in fragile streams across dangerous roads, crossing continents in search of holy shrines. They carry nothing but faith, and faith alone cannot shield them from the blades of bandits, the tolls of warlords, or the wrath of armies that see them as trespassers. Many never return. To the east, the great empire of Byzantium weakens. Its walls still gleam, its emperors still drape themselves in purple, but its grip on the lands of Anatolia and the Levant is loosening. Behind those walls, men whisper of lost provinces, of commanders who cannot control their soldiers, of enemies who close in like wolves circling a wounded beast. And beyond Byzantium, Muslim rulers grow stronger. Armies swell beneath their banners. Cities thrive under their courts. The balance of power tilts further east with each season. To those who travel the pilgrim roads, the air is filled with unease, as though every step takes them deeper into a land that no longer welcomes them. It is here, between empires rising and empires fading, that the Norse appear once more. These are not the reckless raiders of the 9th century, drunk on plunder and fire. No, these men are something different. They are hardened wanderers, soldiers of fortune, whose axes have carved paths across the world. They have fought in England, in France, in the rivers of Rus, and now in Byzantium itself they form the emperor's elite, the Varangian Guard, mercenaries bound not by land or language, but by oath and steel. In their eyes burns a strange mixture, the pride of their ancestors, the hunger of mercenaries, and the devotion of men who walk as both pagans turned Christians and warriors turned pilgrims. Their swords are forged in the north, their loyalty purchased in the east, their reputation carried like a storm wherever they march. They are Vikings, but no longer bound to their fjords. They are global, feared in Constantinople, remembered in Kiev, dreaded in Jerusalem. The 800 who now stand in the desert are not simply raiders. They are disciplined, battle-tested soldiers whose names echo far beyond their homelands. If you hear this and still hesitate to join Crimson Historians, ask yourself, are you the kind of person who lets history's darkest stories fade into silence? Or are you one of us keeping them alive? They were not ordinary men. The 800 who stood in the desert were the remnants of generations tempered by war. Hand-picked veterans, chosen not for their names but for the scars they carried, the battles they had endured, the iron carved into their very bones. Many had fought in England against Saxons and Normans alike, where shield walls clashed until the earth itself split beneath their feet. Others had spilled blood in France, where Viking steel had struck terror into castles and kings, and some had marched beneath the golden eagles of Byzantium, sworn into the Varangian Guard, standing as the emperor's last line of defense. They were wanderers and warriors, men who had crossed seas and continents, who had buried brothers on foreign soil, and who had learned that survival was never guaranteed, only earned through discipline and steel. By the time they reached this desert, they were not simply fighters, they were living chronicles of war itself. Their devotion was unlike anything the enemy could understand. To some it was Norse honor, the unbreakable oath that to retreat was to invite shame so great it would echo into eternity. To others, it was the fire of newly embraced faith, the zeal of men who had taken the cross upon their breast, and saw their mission not as war, but as pilgrimage. For them, the desert was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible, a place where flesh and soul would be tested before the eyes of God. This strange fusion of honor and zeal made them more than mercenaries. It made them relentless. They did not come to weigh the odds. They came to etch their story into legend. And like all legends, the truth becomes blurred. Were there truly 800? Or was it a smaller core of elite warriors, magnified by rumor into an unstoppable host? Perhaps the scribes exaggerated, inflating a band of hardened veterans into a myth so vast it could not be ignored. Yet when the dust rose that day, what mattered was not the number, it was the terror they inspired. Across the desert, the enemy gathered, a host so vast that it seemed to stretch without end, swallowing the horizon in banners and steel. Under the command of local emirs, they came not as scattered bands, but as an army swollen with confidence, their numbers alone enough to crush resistance without a second thought. 40,000 men, bound by the certainty that they could sweep these northern intruders from the earth with the ease of a hand brushing sand from a table. To them, the Vikings were not warriors to be feared. They were foreigners, pale, out of place, gaunt wanderers who did not belong beneath the burning sun. Their enemies mocked them as relics of another world, men doomed by arrogance to march into their own graves. In the laughter of the commanders, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only the promise of a swift slaughter that would serve as warning to all who dared to trespass these lands. Confidence, however, is a weapon with two edges. Armies often break not when the sword strikes, but when the mind does. The enemy believed victory was certain, so certain that their pride blinded them to the steel resolve waiting behind that wall of shields. They mistook silence for fear, stillness for weakness. They did not understand that the calm of the 800 was not surrender, but discipline. A discipline carved from years of facing impossible odds and walking away alive. In war, numbers alone do not terrify. It is the thought of defeat before the first blow is struck that truly kills. And as 40,000 men prepared to crash against a wall of 800, they had no reason to imagine that it would be their minds, not their blades, that would be broken first. The first strike came with thunder. Across the desert plain, the cavalry advanced, a tide of hooves pounding against the earth, their sound rolling like a storm that swallows every thought. The sand shook beneath the weight of war horses bred for terror, armored riders lowering their lances as the horizon itself seemed to collapse into a single charge. The enemy believed this would be the end. No infantry on earth could stand against the fury of mounted steel. 40,000 men watched in anticipation, certain they would see the foreigners broken in the dust, their shields shattered, their line trampled into ruin. But the 800 did not move. They stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, a wall of iron and wood braced against the storm. To outsiders, it looked like madness, as though they were frozen in fear. But this was no paralysis. It was discipline, drilled into their bones on battlefields far from this desert. They knew that to break formation was death. They knew that survival meant unity, and unity meant standing, even as the thunder drew closer. The charge struck like lightning. Horses hurled forward, their riders leaning into the crash, lances splintering against the wall of shields. The impact was violent, a clash of muscle and iron that could be felt in the chest as much as it was heard in the ears, yet the line held. Shields did not shatter, men did not scatter. The wall absorbed the storm, and in its stead, the riders broke. It had happened before. At Hastings, Viking formations had defied the charge of Norman cavalry. At Stamford Bridge, they had stood against overwhelming odds and held the line with nothing but discipline and resolve. And here, once again, the legend repeated itself. The unstoppable cavalry, pride of armies, weapon of kings, broke like waves against stone. In that moment, the laughter of the enemy died. The certainty of swift victory faltered. and the desert carried a silence more terrifying than the charge itself, the silence of disbelief, the silence of 40,000 men watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. These men held their ground when death was inches from their chest. If you can't hold your ground on the subscribe button, explain why in the comments, and don't hide. The cavalry lay broken, scattered in the dust, their pride shattered against a wall of shields that refused to yield. Yet the enemy was far from finished. From the rear of the vast host, archers were ordered forward, thousands of bows bent under the sun, strings creaking as arrows were drawn. Then, with a single command, the sky darkened. Arrows fell like rain, a storm of iron blotting out the light, a sound like rushing water as they tore through the air. For a moment, it seemed as though the 800 would vanish beneath the storm. But again, the Northmen moved as one. Shields lifted, overlapping, curving into a dome of wood and iron that turned vulnerability into defiance. The arrows struck, rattling and splintering, some piercing flesh, many bouncing harmlessly aside. The shield wall became a shell, an unbreakable skin that sheltered its warriors from a rain designed to annihilate. When the storm ended, the Vikings rose again, their formation intact, their eyes still burning. The silence of their survival was louder than any war cry. The commanders of the vast army could not allow hesitation to spread. They ordered the infantry forward, ranks upon ranks, waves of men surging with spears and swords, voices raised to drown their own fear. They rushed like a tide, certain that sheer weight of numbers would crush the foreigners flat. But the tide met a cliff. The shield wall absorbed the impact, shields locking tighter as axes and swords struck back in ruthless counterblows. Men fell screaming against that line, the sand drinking their blood, the waves breaking again and again, but never sweeping the 800 away. The psychological wound deepened. For every enemy who fell, another saw not weakness, but the terrifying resolve of men who refused to break. The sight of 800 standing unyielding against thousands became more dreadful than any weapon. The realization crept into the hearts of the 40,000. If such a small force could withstand everything they threw, what chance did they truly have? The infantry waves receded, broken on the wall of shields. The archers' storm had failed. The cavalry's thunder had been silenced, yet still the 40,000 pressed forward, driven by pride and disbelief. They could not accept what their eyes already knew, that the 800 would not be crushed so easily. And then came the weapon that turned battle into nightmare. At first it was nothing more than a flicker, a strange shimmer in the air, then a burst of fire, sudden and unnatural, leaping against the desert wind. Oil, pitch, or some secret alchemy carried from the east, no one could say for certain. Some swore it was Greek fire, the Byzantine terror said to cling like liquid flame, impossible to extinguish. Others claimed it was simpler, tar and oil ignited in a desperate gambit. But to the men who saw it, truth did not matter. What they saw was fire falling upon them as though the heavens themselves had turned against them. Flames roared, carried by the wind, devouring flesh and fabric alike. Horses screamed as fire clung to their hides. Men staggered as their armor grew red with heat. The desert filled with smoke, thick and choking, blotting out sight and breath. Panic surged faster than the flames themselves, spreading through the mass of 40,000 like a second inferno. In war, fear burns deeper than fire. Men trampled each other as they fled, their voices lost in the roar of flames. Order dissolved, commanders' shouts were swallowed in chaos. The proud host that had marched certain of its victory now shrank back in terror, their courage consumed by an enemy they could not strike down. Was it truth or legend? Historians still debate. Did the 800 truly unleash Greek fire, a secret weapon carried from the Byzantine arsenal, or did scribes of later centuries embellish, adding fire to a tale already too unbelievable to ignore? No one can say with certainty, but the flames live on in the story, and the story is sometimes stronger than fact. What matters is this: in the minds of those who survived, the 800 did not simply resist. They became more than men. They became a vision of terror, of fire and steel, that could not be broken. The fire spread faster than reason. Panic tore through the enemy ranks, men trampling their own comrades in desperate attempts to escape the flames. Horses shrieked and bolted wild, crushing soldiers under their hooves. The neat order of 40,000 dissolved into chaos, a writhing mass of bodies colliding and collapsing upon itself. In that frenzy, death claimed more than any blade could. Men suffocated under the press of their own allies, their cries lost in the roar of the inferno. Others fell upon their swords rather than be swallowed by the fire. The battlefield became a graveyard in motion, a storm of terror where survival depended not on courage but on blind chance. Chroniclers, writing long after the dust had settled, spoke of numbers too vast to comprehend. They claimed that 35,000 and more perished, that the desert was littered with corpses so thick they blotted out the sand itself, that no survivors escaped the wrath of the 800. They wrote that the rout was not simply defeat, but annihilation, a massacre so complete it defied the natural order. And yet, the truth is harder to measure. Did tens of thousands truly fall? Or did fear do the killing long before steel and flame touched flesh? In the psychology of war, the mind breaks long before the body. A disciplined, unshaken core could scatter an army many times its size. Numbers mattered less than fear, and fear became the true weapon that day. Still, the legend endured. The desert was remembered not as a battlefield, but as a place where reality itself bent, where 800 men erased 40,000. Whether the figures were real or myth, what mattered was the story, and the story was unstoppable. Even medieval scribes exaggerated so their stories survived. If you don't subscribe now, you're letting this channel vanish into silence. Don't betray history like that. Legends are never born in silence. They rise from the mouths of survivors, from the pens of chroniclers, from the imaginations of those who need heroes greater than life itself. The story of the 800 was carried across lands and centuries, told and retold, until fact and myth bled together like ink spilled across parchment. Some said they fought under the sign of the cross, holy warriors chosen by God to strike down heathens in the desert. Others whispered that they carried the fury of Odin himself, a last echo of pagan rage unleashed upon a faithless world. To many they were not men at all, but an omen, a reminder that the divine, or perhaps the damned, could still walk among mortals. The truth is less certain. Historians search the records and find fragments, accounts of pilgrim routes, of Byzantine allies, of skirmishes between Norse mercenaries and Muslim rulers. Some evidence points to a clash, but nowhere are the numbers clear. Was it truly 40,000? Or was the enemy smaller, their losses magnified by fear and by the embellishment of scribes? Was it 800 Norsemen alone, or were they supported by other European pilgrims, woven into the tale only to be forgotten by time? What is certain is that disciplined warriors, trained by years of unrelenting conflict, could hold against forces far larger than themselves. History has shown it again and again. At Stamford Bridge, a handful of Norsemen delayed an army long enough to change the course of battle. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans became immortal, not because they won, but because they refused to yield. Numbers alone do not write history. Will, discipline, and the terror of the unexpected are far more powerful weapons. Yet the medieval mind did not hunger for statistics, it craved miracles. It sought proof that the divine hand touched the earth, that legends still walked among men. And so the tale grew, a victory carved by 800 against 40,000, a massacre that defied reason. For the faithful, it was divine justice. For the fearful, it was a warning. For storytellers, it was gold. This is how myth becomes history, and history becomes myth. A battle that may have been small in scope became a monument in memory, larger than truth itself. And perhaps that was the point. The desert was not only stained with blood, it was seeded with legend, a seed that would take root in the imagination of Europe for generations to come. The tale of the 800 did not die in the desert. It traveled back across the pilgrim roads, carried by tongues eager to speak of miracles and horrors. It entered the halls of Europe as a whisper, then a roar, and in time it became more than a memory. It became a seed. When the Crusades began only decades later, men marched under the shadow of such stories. Tales of small bands defying impossible odds filled them with conviction. They believed that if 800 could stand unbroken before 40,000, then entire armies of the faithful could reclaim the Holy Land. The legend of the massacre was no longer about what happened. It was about what men needed to believe. This is the legacy of dark history, not cold records carved in stone, but fire passed from voice to voice, reshaped until it burned brighter than fact. Legends endure not because they are true, but because they capture the hunger, the fear, and the faith of those who tell them. And so the 800 remain, suspended between history and myth. Were they mercenaries, pilgrims, or chosen warriors of God? The answer no longer matters. What matters is the story that against reason, against numbers, against death itself, they did not fall. These warriors are remembered 1,000 years later because their story was told again and again. Crimson historians will keep telling these stories, but only if you stand with us. Subscribe now or admit in the comments why you'd let this history die with you.